and welcome to LawWiser on Air. This is Aman Abbas, and I'll be hosting the podcast today. The topic of today's podcast is ESG scrutiny, from voluntary disclosure to litigation, liability, and enforcement risk. Uh, ESG started as a voluntary exercise, but it has now moved towards voluntary disclosure to mandatory auditable legal obligations. This has resulted in a lot of litigations that we have seen in recent times, regulatory enforcements, and at the same time, personal liabilities for directors as well as promoters. So this is getting very, very serious now. And we've got the experts here who know the subject well. And I would, you know, straight away start introducing each one of them to you. Um, we have with us Shujat Bin Ali. He is the Chief Legal Officer with Fourth Partner Energy. Welcome, Shujat. Then we have Mahek Oberoi, who's Legal Head, Hydro APAC, GE Vernova. And then we have Shruti Kanodia Srivastav, who is a Managing Partner with Sega Stigall. Welcome all of you to this podcast. Um, I'll start with Shujat. In fact, as I made a little introduction about the subject, Shujat, ESG actually became as a voluntary disclosure, and people were doing a lot of PR and marketing around it. To now, this has become much more serious. Are we now at a stage where it creates real legal liabilities for companies and the boards and the promoters? What do you have to say on that?
Yeah, so as you rightly mentioned, it started as a voluntary disclosure, and people, companies were following, SASB, GRE, and they were voluntarily adopting it. And eventually, if you see, even in India, we have this BRSR, code. Not only in India but also globally, every company, which is listed, have some form of a mandatory disclosures. So clearly, from a voluntary, it is getting into mandatory disclosures. Now, coming toward the liability aspect, the one liability is the whole disclosure liabilities, just like the representation of financials, how important it is. Similarly, right representation of a non-financial data is equally important. So the liability is just like the way how the financials are treated. So from a disclosure liability, whether it is the financials or the data or the commitments what we are making. The second aspect of a liability comes from a overall governance standpoint. The boards are responsible for all the ESG frameworks, policies, the disclosures, commitments, and all. And a lot of companies have specific responsibilities. Even the Companies Act, the specific responsibilities are given on the board. So that's the governance and another compliance related liability. The third is the contractual and commercial. Increasingly, we are seeing in investor agreements, shareholders agreements, even into procurement agreements, coming from the investors or the bankers or the financiers, also the customers as well. All these flow down obligations are also coming in the contracts. So from a contractual standpoint, also it becomes liability. If you see all the three aspects, disclosure liability and the governance related liability and the contractual and commercial liability, I think that's the way things are getting moving. And from that standpoint, I think organizations have to think to how do they mitigate the liability while they are working on the years.
Yeah, in fact, uh, yeah, I think it's actually expanding itself quite a bit. And in fact, at one point of time, I'll also ask about the roles of general counsels in this entire piece. But let me just go to Shruti for now, and ask you that how ESG is actually reshaping boardroom accountability. And as we have seen it written, but actually are directors and promoters um, really facing the risk for being personally accountable for something like this, and if yes, then what are the things that they should actually worry about, and what could actually these liabilities mean for them?
So see, ESG is really a huge part of boardrooms these days. You have ESG committees, and the reason it has become such a big thing is that one is, of course, the liability aspect of it, which sure does come. But more than the liability, which is not so well codified at the moment, I would say it's the objective also of net zero, which every company wants to now show as well. So it is sustainability initiatives is something that is really driving the boards these days. That every company, even infrastructure companies for whom it's actually more difficult to really have sustainable practices, are really adopting it in a big way, because governance is one aspect. And so, to be clear, frankly, in ESG, there is no one framework apart from the BRSR reporting, which really brings it all together. But individually, the environment aspect of it, of course, has liabilities associated with it if you're not complying with it. The social aspect of it again has liabilities, the labor codes, the new labor codes which have come about. And most companies we see are actually taking the initiatives of even informing their supply chain that these are the changes which have come about in the law, because they understand that liability is not just the personal liability or a liability for one incident. It's the larger liability also which the company faces in terms of not being competitive in the market, not having the type of finance available which is today available for sustainable companies, and also the general reputational advantage which you get. I won't say, I mean, it may not be so much of a disadvantage unless everything comes out in the open, but it is certainly an advantage if you have a good ESG rating. And most boards are very cognizant of the fact that you need to do what you need to do to ensure that the ESG ratings are really well, and it's not greenwashing, which they are supporting. Because greenwashing, of course, leads to a lot of, uh, well, bad publicity, sure, but also liability. So the boards are quite cognizant and uh, you know, quite relevant in that sense in terms of how they are looking at the ESG aspect of it. And governance, of course, has always had a lot more emphasis, even in the Indian context. So, in terms of liability, there is the unfortunate part is that there is no combined framework under which the liability is uh, captured, but it is being it's there, and everybody understands the aspect of it.
In fact, coming to the framework part, I think that's a very important topic that you've raised. In fact, different countries have got, different frameworks and different, ways to evaluate this. And so, in fact, I would, you know, all of you want to weigh in on whether we should have, one standard framework that, a lot of countries have agreed upon. But I'll come to that towards the end. uh, I have a related question on this for Mahek. So, the rules are evolving across regions. How are companies managing those cross-border conflicts that are arising out of it, especially when one jurisdiction expects less and the other one expects more, where it actually starts to get tricky legally?
So I think the partial answer is in your question itself, that there is no unified ESG standard, right? It is in patchwork, and we're all trying to sew it together, and there are still cracks in it. And so imagine, for example, if you have a manufacturing facility in India from where you're procuring goods or components for a project in Europe. Now, that regulatory regime that Europe functions under is very different from what India functions under. So I think the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, it requires you to, identify, prevent, and mitigate all of these environmental impacts. Now, how far do you think you can implement that way down the value chain in India? There is a huge gap. So, what is actually happening is, because the Indian vendors want their work, they are signing off on anything and everything. And they don't know what they're signing off on, whether it is audit rights or whether it is the emission levels, or whether it is human rights, etc. They don't know what they're signing off on per se. So that is where the disputes are arising. And like Shudat had said, we're in that transition period. We're not mandatory, we're not voluntary, we're somewhere in the middle moving towards mandatory. I mean, even the BRSR got diluted in March, right? They moved from assurance to assurance or assessment or something like that. So our government also realizes that we as an infrastructure are not completely ready and we need some more time. Again, going back to the supply chain also, all the suppliers that we have are mostly micro and small enterprises. They do not have the financial capacity to be able to meet the requirements of the European framework. So that is where it always gets tricky. There are gaps and compliance becomes an issue. And we are still not in the position to be able to completely fill that gap.
Yeah, so I think so that's the thing. I mean, we have a different framework, but the companies are signing up to something totally different arising out of the originating country, and that's where things become actually bad. Um,
And
and so
also, just to add, when I'm talking about the value chain, even from a realistic perspective, one may be able to keep some track of your first tier suppliers. But how do you go down the entire value chain?
I
We
mean, these are the
haven't reached that stage. How
absolutely.
do you tell me how you're going to trace your scope 3 emissions down to the value chain? I don't think India has an answer for that yet.
Yeah, in fact, there are multiple issues where, these kind of, questions actually arise. ESG is the latest one that has joined it. And, when it comes to, transactions, so M&A transactions, so one part is about the supply chain, but, when it comes to the transaction part, how is ESG moving from a diligence checkbox to a factor that can materially impact valuation, or it could even become a deal breaker? So this question is directed towards Shruti, who could actually, give us a little perspective on this.
So, when a few years ago, when people used to ask for a ESG diligence, it was literally a check the box thing. They would give you a questionnaire, they would say, please answer yes, no. If it's a no, please give your explanation. If it's a yes, give an explanation. And frankly, most of the people would not even look at it again. That is how it started. And most of it would come because, a European entity or a US investor was investing, and they had this requirement where you had to do the ESG check. So you would get a questionnaire, people would fill it up, and nobody would even try opening it again. But that's not the case anymore. Now you have representations, warranties clearly baked in saying that you will comply with governance mechanisms, environmental hazards, environmental compliances are baked into the documents itself. Uh, Certainly, the labor code compliances, etc., are also baked. So it has become a lot more value accretive because companies which have a good ESG score, even if they may not have actually been scored or rated, etc., but people who have actually focused on that are getting better valuations simply because the diligence exercise, the reps and warranties, the indemnities are easier for them to negotiate, right? So the investors are also giving them a premium. And the fact that there are instruments coming out in the market which are focusing on companies which have this whole, whether it's the green bonds or the sustainable finance initiatives, which have been taken by many of the banks, uh, that is certainly helping. So the investor community is looking at ESG in a more meaningful way. And that is, of course, trickle down also. The companies are also looking to improve their ESG score, make sure that they can give clean answers to questions on environmental related issues. Uh, Many of them may not have it as a very relevant thing, but manufacturing companies and all certainly have it. And they want to make sure that they can give clean answers to the investor community that is there. And that's certainly impacting their valuations as well. I believe there was a Deloitte report also, which came out in 24 or 25, which said that this, M&A, in M&A, ESG has certainly impacted valuations to a very large extent.
Super. In fact, and is it like, becoming a deal breaker as well?
So, see, a large liability issue sure can become a deal breaker. So when, as an investor, diligences are being done, and we've been on both sides, so I can tell you that the investors are looking to make sure that there's no large environmental claim which can come on the company, or there's rampant non-compliance, governance is an issue. It is certainly a deal breaker. And on the opposite side, if a company has good governance, has maintained its policies, uh, then that also indicates to the investor that this company is generally compliant and it's a good ethical company. So it has therefore also led to many deals have not materialized because on compliance front the companies were not very strong.
Sure. And let's come to the greenwashing point. Shujat, I wanted to ask you that how strong the systems are to be able to identify greenwashing, first of all, and what are regulators actually focusing on, and what do companies often get wrong, when it comes to what they're showing and what they actually have.
Yeah, see, because the ESG and sustainability is such a important thing and is such a fad or fashion to be in. Most of the companies now they want to demonstrate either their product or service, is sustainable. So making exaggerated claims or misleading claims or deceptive claims or claims which is not scientifically substantiated. I think these are the some of the examples of greenwashing. An example could be like our my product is completely recyclable or natural or made from a organic the products or using false labels, right? Using different visual imagery, which can actually give a perception for either the consumers or maybe the investors that okay the product or a service is sustainable. So I think these are all forms a part of the greenwashing. And from a regulatory standpoint, if you see, I think the Ministry of Consumer Protection already have a CCPA, the greenwashing guidelines. Also from an advertising standpoint, because now whenever any organization talking about the claims, they definitely use the advertising as a media. So the ASCII has specific guidelines. Alongside that, I think SEBI itself, has made this BRSR and ESG related aspect a little stronger by putting those assurance as a important element, which is going to be mandatory at least for few companies. Alongside that, making ESG related debt framework guidelines as well. Alongside these, I think the conventional stuff which is like the company's law itself have some of the provisions. I mean, we have the existing regulations also which can cater to these alongside the civil and criminal related aspects where an affected party can leverage any of these regulations. But yes, in India we have not seen the the extent of litigation or the potential greenwashing claims or class actions, so unlike the West. But that definitely will catch up in future, as we see, be it from a consumer or could be from an investor or could be from any affected party. But yes, there are regulatory framework which is available. How it will be used, I mean, what kind of numbers of claims we'll see is something to watch for. But yes, again, any organization whenever they're talking about this the claims and sustainability and ESG, they need to keep about all these aspects to mitigate the liability.
I think there are a lot of big claims that are being made, not just in ESG, but related to medical issues and whatnot. And we will have to see what is the kind of crackdown that we're going to see moving forward. Mahek, in fact, you were giving an example of a cross-border, supply chain, and enforcement of ESG, guidelines across the value chain, etc. Now, I wanted to actually pick up, EPC contracts, particularly project structuring, etc. You know, how the commitments are actually showing on paper, and are these like a good faith promises, or this is much more concrete that could actually trigger liability, from the person who's commissioned, who is actually commissioning the project, can they actually, are putting things in a more concrete way in those contracts, so that the liability, becomes clearer.
So more often than not, as far as India is concerned, right now it's more of a good faith measure. In different parts of different jurisdictions, possibly yes, there are, and I've seen those too. There are some real liability triggers as well. But what I have not seen, you will never have. No, I will never say never, but usually you will not have a contract which is really breaking down every single aspect of compliance of ESG. It is going to be one blanket statement, which is going to say that you're going to comply with all, the environmental laws, etc., of the jurisdiction. So now the problem when it's cross-border, what is that jurisdiction? How many jurisdictions are you really going to comply with? What is that agreement? No one knows till a dispute's going to happen. They will not raise that question. If we're talking about real liability triggers like linked to payment, ESG linked to payment structures or ESG warranties, we don't see them commonly in contracts right now. We're not there yet. In fact, even in December 2025, FIDIC came out with its carbon management guide. Okay, where they're talking about carbon balance sheets and incentives and penalties, but it's a guide. And then I think April of this year also we had ICBC that was trying to somewhere streamline these various definitions that we have in terms of circular materials or net zero embodied carbon, because everyone uses these terms, but there is no measurable scale particularly used for certain kinds of definitions. For some they are, but for most they aren't, right? So all of these factors, even if you're talking about when you go into real liability triggers, when do these real liability triggers come in is when you are able to interpret it correctly. And that interpretation is still vague because we haven't gone into measuring everything and every compliance, the root of it. How are you going to do it? Like I was mentioning before, right? The scope 3 emissions, how will you measure it right down that value chain where the smallest of vendors is sitting? And if you are able to do it also, what you're going to do about it? Right, you can't. What's going to happen if you're going to lay this a huge penalty on it? You're not, that vendor's not going to be able to give it. So, all those small factors need to still be figured out.
And is it because of the like, particularly in India, is it because of the clear-cut guidelines issue, or is it that the companies are actually um, kind of taking it easy at this point of time, and when things become clearer in terms of guideline, etc., then they would kind of start to put it.
No,
What?
I don't think that companies are taking it easy in India anymore. I think they're much more informed, like Shujat was also mentioning and Shruti was mentioning. Boards are better informed. At least the bigger organizations and the listed companies, etc., are making very valuable steps towards complying with all of these. That is happening. So I wouldn't say that they are lackadaisical. Um, but what does happen is, for example, with the BRSR becoming a little lax now since March, um, I think Indian mentality somewhere is that jab hoga tab dekh lenge. So, they will try, they
Yeah.
will continue trying to comply, but that impact of serious implementation is going to come those 2 months before when that notification is going to become real. That does happen. But like I said, they're informed and they're trying. We're in that trial phase right now. Yeah.
And then people are being more practical in terms of, how the contract should actually be played out and how, the business should actually keep going. Otherwise, it becomes
Yeah,
very
because
tight.
see what
Yeah.
happens is the larger companies, what they're doing is they're now putting it in their contract. But they have not foreseen it through the end that what if that last vendor of mine will not be able to meet it. What they're saying is, I've put it in my contract, now it's your responsibility how you figure it out. But that's not a practical take if you take the entire project cycle, right?
Absolutely. Now, coming to the finance side, Shruti, um, with increasing focus on sustainable finance, how are ESG consideration influencing lending terms? Security structures, risk allocations in financing transactions.
So many, I mean, of course, RBI has also come out with some guidelines, but those are more on the draft stage, so I won't go into those. But if you look at many of the banks, especially the global banks, they have come out with sustainable finance instruments. And they are looking, they are pricing it lower because if you have a good ESG rating, so the risk, your risk rating is considered to be slightly lower. But in practice, when you look at it, getting those or meeting those requirements is not something that most companies in India are able to do that easily. Because while they may have put in place ESG mechanisms and they may be promoting ESG, so to say, the fact remains that, as Mehak also said, the standards are not there, right? So if you don't have a standard, what do you measure things against? And even if you look at ESG ratings, every ESG rating company has its own criteria, and it's not just that they are different; they are poles apart. So you could really be having a huge difference between one rating and the other rating, right? You could be fairly low in one rating and fairly high in another rating. So while sustainable finance products are there and they are looking, green bonds and all are there, but the question comes, how do you measure greenwashing, which is difficult to do because unless you have standards, how do you say that something has been breached? And when we come to the existing laws in India, while there, of course, there are environment laws, there are laws governing how social impact, etc., has to be there. Governance laws are there, but really, those are very bare minimum standards. So you do not do risk rating on the basis of those standards. The risk rating is based on much higher standards, which is not really codified. So greenwashing being a real concern, and with products being there, but access to those products is not something which is there beyond listed companies where BRSR reports are there. There is something to really judge it against. For the larger part of the market, these products are, I think, more aspirational. Even on the finance side, they are more aspirational. They're not something which they can actually access or which they can comply with, simply because there's nothing to demonstrate that really they are meeting the requirements which these products have.
Okay. In fact, that actually brings me again to the point that do you think consultants like you, Shruti, should actually initiate to have, different rating agencies come on one platform and, try to thrash out something that is like more in sync with each other rather than being poles apart?
So efforts are happening for these ESG ratings, and SEBI also came out with the framework, etc., to make sure that there is some measurability. Those the ratings which are there can be relied upon. So efforts are happening, but see, the problem remains that unless you have the basic standard of what would constitute, say, compliance with uh, a basic standard of ESG, how does even a rating agency measure it? Unless you have a larger framework in place, and that framework allows for a graded, perhaps, compliance, how do you even measure it? So, rating agencies sure should come to a platform, and that's a great idea. But it there is a framework issue which also needs to be resolved along with that.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I'm coming now towards the integration of ESG into the governance and compliance frameworks within corporates. Um, do you think, Shujat, it is happening or it is working in a silo right now?
Yeah. So firstly, if you see, I mean, ESG means different thing for multiple people. For some, they view it from a compliance perspective, tick box exercise. For some, it is more from a reporting standpoint, right? For some of them, it is because of a contractual obligation. I need to keep my client satisfied. That is one approach. So for some of the companies, it is purely how do they mitigate the ESG risk for the company. So that is one perspective. So what I have seen is every company treats in a different aspect. And in some organizations, I think it's the environment, health and safety team which focuses on those aspects. Only few teams, work on it. And each of these teams, while working on a similar objective, have different policies, different technologies, different KPIs, and all of that stuff. So when we see all these aspects, definitely it looks that it's not integrated. The right approach, of course, for the future would be to have the ESG as part of a core strategy. I mean, like how the organizations devise the DNA of the organization, the values, the strategy, who the organization want to be. Because at the end of the day, ESG is all about working with stakeholders, protecting environment, working properly with the society, and working in a proper governed manner. So in those situations, I think the board plays a critical role as to how do they define. Do they want to keep ESG restricted as a few policies, few nice to looking documents, and some standard the presentations, and how yearly we have one sustainability report and all that stuff. Then it become a siloed approach, and with few people responsible for these aspects. A real integrated approach starts from a board when they see that okay, it has to be a board's responsibility. It has to go along with the strategy of the company. Relook about the values, relook the DNA as to how we want to be. From there, it comes that okay, whether there should be a separate ESG committee, because governance starts from the board. They may talk about okay, whether there should be ESG committee, or even at an executive level, instead of a responsibility, spread it across, do they need to have a one anchor which takes the championing of all these responsibilities, be it CEO, be it CFO, or the general counsel for that matter. Maybe some companies have a chief sustainability officer. If not anything, an executive council which is responsible for all this stuff. So once we have this, I think channelization of right people, process, technology can be leveraged well. Otherwise, everyone is working in a different manner, because any initiative they will have technology, they will have some people, process, data, KPIs, and all that stuff. So an integration would definitely help, of course, but you start from the board or at a committee level, even at an executive level, and at a functional level as well. When we talk about ESG initiative, each function and each department can have specific goals, their KPIs and their compensations also linked to that, which will achieve the departmental goals, functional goals, and at the end the organizational goals. Of course, I mean it takes a lot of commitment, but there are some organizations which are advancing to this maturity level where they want to go beyond the compliance, beyond the reporting, but this is how they want to known for when they work with their stakeholders. So I think that's the thoughts which I have. And a lot of companies, I mean matured companies who have crossed that level, they are challenging themselves. I mean Shruti talked about rating. People are also going in terms of benchmarking and seeing that how all of these ESG goals are impacting. And naturally, they're talking about net zero, carbon neutral, and all. Not only on the E but S and the G aspect. But I think integration will definitely help a lot. In terms of giving an organization a clear direction.
So do you think some companies are ahead of others or some industries are ahead of others in this? I mean, has that already started to happen, what
Yes.
you just
Yes, I
suggested?
think largely the multinational companies are ahead of the curve, because we see a clear-cut ESG committee, with the board also oversight, and they have a chief sustainability officer. There is a separate ESG function. They have a clear-cut KPIs, right from the CEO level to all the team members as well. So, and of course, in terms of the ratings and awards and all the stuff, there are few companies starting by the multinationals. Then, of course, even in India, some of the top, 50, 100, BSE census companies. I mean, I don't want to name them, but they're actually challenging themselves and trying to be a little ahead of the
Yeah.
curve in terms of an integration.
Mehak, what is the kind of a role a general counsel would? I mean, is the role of general counsel become slightly larger in the in ESG context moving forward?
Yeah, of course. I think all of the aspects that we've discussed today, the GC is going to sit at the middle of all of that, trying to bridge that gap. So most definitely, GCs will have a larger role. Something is, take for example that there is a piece of land, and you have a bit of a pond in between or something, and you check the water, and the water levels, every the water levels, or the uh, what, I'm sorry, I'm not getting the term. Shujat, what is that term? In
Groundwater level is what you're
the
talking.
groundwater levels and all of that are questionable from an American standpoint, but not from an Indian standpoint. So now one gets sued in America because you're not meeting their level or their compliance requirement. But India says that I'm meeting mine. So you can't pass down that liability to me. So how do you bridge that gap? So these kind of questions are still coming up. Now, if you draw analogy with arbitration, even arbitration has its hiccups in cross-jurisdictional issues. And I mean, internationally, we're coming to terms, or we're really evolving at a fast pace as far as arbitration is concerned. So you can imagine environment, we're infants right now. So there's a lot of growing up to do, and the growing up has to be helmed by the GC, the parent.
Yeah, just to add, Aman, we talked about investment, we talked about board advisory, we talked about risk, we talked about compliance, we talked about attracting investors, green financing, reputational related risk, liabilities, how do you protect? I think, even in terms of contracts drafting, and, also the culture part of it, right? The ESG communications. I think with all of these aspects and in drafting policies, general counsel is at the midst of all of these, advising, be it the board, be it the CFO, be it the CHRO or the CSO. So I think it's an interplay of legal, business, finance, reputation, risk, and also GC is definitely in midst of it. And in some of the organizations, there is a strong possibility that GC, by virtue of an expertise around the G part, which is already there, and the S part also, there's a lot of involvement. Uh, I have seen, companies where the GC is also, adding a additional role of leading or championing or being the anchor of the ESG as well.
Yeah, because
Absolutely, absolutely.
our role is no longer binary, right? I mean, a decade ago, it could be just legal advice whether you can or cannot do it. Now it is more about you've bridged that gap, and now there's a risk partnership between the business and you.
Absolutely, absolutely. GC is becoming quite pivotal in many areas, and ESG definitely, I particularly think that GC will have a much bigger role moving forward.
Saying that many GCs are frankly driving the whole ESG initiatives for their companies because
Yeah,
informing the boards of what is the requirement and how they can improve this and how even the business functions can benefit from this.
Yeah, I was part of the ESG committee in my previous organization, even also currently I'm part of the ESG committee, providing mindsets and inputs.
Nice. Now let's look at the disputes part. Okay, now how ESG issues now starting to influence how claims and arbitrations are actually handled. Um, are you like Mahek? This question is for you. That are you seeing that ESG becoming a central risk in litigation moving forward?
So environment is definitely become a huge issue as far as disputes are concerned. But when you talk about India, when it is something that is clearly defined under, say, the Environment Act or the Air Act or the Water Act, then is different. But when you talk about my field, the issues that we may face is, again, like I was mentioning before, you've asked the supplier to sign off on something that they will comply with everything, and some new rule or regulation comes about, and the supplier will raise his hand and say that this is change in law, this requires a variation order because this is not something I was doing before. Then you look at the contract and you say, look, you agreed to do it. And the supplier will say, okay, I don't have the money, I'll walk out of the project. Now, in projects such as this, it is not as simple as you're manufacturing a dairy milk and the person who's packaging said that I'm going to walk out and you'll find another one easily. We're talking about millions and billions in dollars of projects which have minimum 5 to 6 years of gestation period. So for a vendor to just walk out on you, it has multiple implications. So those are the kind of disputes that are happening. That if a vendor has untimely terminated the contract, or they're fighting the fact that it should be change in law and how change in law should be interpreted, or how the definition of law in itself should be interpreted. So those are the kind of disputes right now which are center stage as far as my industry is concerned. But on another level, what becomes easier is if there is something that's already defined in our laws. And the moment you go into the undefined or the vague subjective terms like we were talking about earlier, then there's the issue. How do you demonstrate it? How do you measure it? And how do you enforce it? And then you have when you have experts coming into arbitration, or you have arbitrators who are trying to understand these disputes, they're also these scales are just as untested right now. So it's again that entire gamut, because these are non-legal standards, right? So these frameworks are difficult to measure, enforce, and demonstrate. So those are challenges that we are facing now, but we're definitely moving towards environment becoming, I think already we have 30% of our arbitrations are about environment.
Absolutely. So I think this is my last question for all of you, starting with Shruti. Where should the law draw the line between enabling sustainability and policing overstatement? Where the law should actually draw the line?
So frankly, I mean, I don't think that that's really a thing which is pulling in two directions. You have to make sure that uh, everything. So right now, because of the approach that we have, which is more of a somewhere between mandatory and voluntary, so this question of even policing overstatement comes up. Overstatement will always need to be policed, right? Because at the end of the day, you have to not just comply with the requirements. The idea behind ESG and initiatives like this is that you go above and beyond, right? It's an ever evolving standard, and it has to be an ever evolving standard because by their very nature, these are things which, if you have to be with the times, if you have to be with the global standards, they will need to keep evolving. So the law will have to keep policing in that sense overstatement, because unless they do that, there isn't really going to be a differentiator between people who comply and people who do not comply. So I think it's not that much of a struggle between the two. Both will have to go hand in hand. And unless they go hand in hand, it will not really, what we are looking for as ESG being a standard will not really take place.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Any closing thoughts, Shujat and Mehak?
So, I mean, if you really see in terms of the regulation versus sustainability and all, I mean, if you just take a step back, ultimately, ESG is all about, working with, all the stakeholders, right? Protecting the environment and, protecting the society and, governing in a such a manner that the organization works well and it mitigates the risk and, be in a good position to work with all the stakeholders, right? And also, if you see from an ESG standpoint, it promotes best practices, right? Be it electrical, related energy related investment, energy transition, or proper waste management, right? Consumption of natural resources. All of these aspects, be it in the E or in the S, where we talk about diversity, where we talk about no discrimination, working with the contractors, safety, all of these aspects. And G, of course, we all know governance in an ethical manner, risk mitigating approach, thinking about all stakeholders. All of these aspects, promote best business practices, and it, factors in terms of how the company should shape and what kind of investment decisions to be done. And eventually, uh, research will definitely suggest that a company which is practicing good ESG practices will it, get good premium in terms of a valuation, or in terms of getting their share prices enhanced. I think that is something which we'll definitely have to see, and a lot of studies do suggest. And having a right ESG framework, will promote the best business practices. Eventually, it helps all the shareholders and all stakeholders as well. Shareholders get right, dividend. The creditors and the finances, get the best, debt coverage, and the consumers get the best products, and the community and the society, get the best, the support, as they're coexisting along with the organization. So I think that's the way to see is what I feel.
Mehak,
So I
thoughts
think
you'll have?
companies should think about going down right to the grassroots level to train and inform people of what ESG really entails and how it needs to be implemented and why it needs to be implemented. If you really want a change to come about and people to look at it not from a policy compliance perspective, but actually to make a difference to India, then that's where you need to start. And that's where instead of ESG, I'd like to call it the GSE, because it's governance of sustainability of environmental frameworks. That's what you're really trying to do, because without governance, none of this works. It can't be put into place. So yeah.
Thank you so much, all of you, for this really lovely, insightful discussion. Uh, this is LawWiser on air for you. We will be coming back to you soon with another very interesting topic and some amazing experts that we always bring. Thank you so much. Thank you for watching.